The simulation has outrun the so-called reality. That concept in Baudrillard he calls the hyperreal. Hyperreality is more real than real, and it's built on the real. It is not as though the hyperreal could get by without injections of reality in it.
If a real is disappearing, it's not because we lack of it. On the contrary, there is too much of a real.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I am here with David, the host of the Theory and Philosophy podcast, which you can find on all podcast platforms as well as on his YouTube channel. David is an academic, and he does some of the most wonderful explanations of very complicated theoretical concepts. Today, we're going to be mainly discussing the theories of Jean Baudrillard, particularly that of Simulacra and Simulation. Baudrillard is often labeled as the high priest of postmodernism, and I thought David from Theory and Philosophy would be the perfect person to bring on this podcast because he has covered just about every single Baudrillard text, I believe, at least almost all of them on his channel, which he discusses in depth on that. I learned a lot from these podcasts myself, and I highly suggest that if you want to learn about Baudrillard's theories, you check those out. The links will be in the description. But before we get too deep into Baudrillard's theories, David, would you like to introduce yourself and just what you do and what got you into Baudrillard?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a doctoral student now doing my work in media studies, specifically on conspiracy theories. So not much Baudrillard figures into there. But I got into Baudrillard's work in my undergrad, where I went to school at Bishop's University in Quebec, where Jerry Coulter taught, who is the founder of the International Journal of Baudrillard Studies. So he obviously had an inspiration on me, including some others at that school. It was kind of an anomaly. A few profs there wrote about Baudrillard, which was, you don't see that very often. So that kind of got me into it. And yeah, ever since then, I've had an unending interest in his work and how I can make it work for myself.
Yeah, that's one thing that's very true about Baudrillard, like you said, is that he's not studied very much in academia, despite, in my opinion, him being of a lot of importance in today's age. But I think it's because of his aphoristic style. He writes a little bit kind of like Nietzsche, in that it's very all over the place. It's not a clear, concrete argument, but I think that's what also makes him kind of fun to read, at least for me. But he's definitely hard to understand for that reason, because he doesn't define the terms he says a lot of the time, and he'll use terms in sometimes contradictory ways, or at least it'll appear that way. That's kind of what drove me to actually find your podcast. Is I think I found your stuff about just over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and because I was just looking for secondary sources on Baudrillard to kind of understand all this stuff. And yeah, so those were really great. And that's what we're going to be doing today, is kind of going over some associated terms. I think one of the most famous terms associated with Jean Baudrillard is that of simulacra and simulation, because that's what's often associated with the Matrix. And as is widely known with most people who've at least digged a bit into Baudrillard's work, is that Baudrillard did not like the movie The Matrix very much. He famously said, "The Matrix is the type of movie that the Matrix would produce." And kind of mainly because he thought that the binary distinction between simulation and reality was too obvious, and that for him, that kind of misses the point, because for him, the distinction is not obvious at all. But how would you define simulacrum and simulation? Because those are two things that are sometimes used interchangeably, even though they sort of mean different things, even though they're associated. How would you define these two terms?
Yeah, that's a good point, insofar as they are often used interchangeably. And I think that there are different levels of understanding of Baudrillard's work. So you can have someone who understands Baudrillard a lot, and by virtue of that, use these terms interchangeably. Or you could have somebody who doesn't understand Baudrillard at all and use these terms interchangeably. Now, the first person, the one that knows about his work a lot, will have a strong theoretical basis to actually use them interchangeably. Now, in order to explain that point by looking at each of the terms on their own, I think that, to put it as simply as possible, simulation refers to, in Baudrillard's work, just the nature of human existence itself. So we engage in our world through artifice. That is, we engage with our world through language, we engage with our world through our senses. And so we don't actually have contact with the world per se or with each other, but all of those interactions are mediated through representing machines, be it our eyes or our ears that just represent the world to our brains that we then make sense of, or we do so through language. So as far as we are humans, we are simulating machines to some extent. Now, he's describing this situation as one in which we all live. So reality for Baudrillard is very much a reality of simulation. Now, he's not condemning this. He's just saying what I believe to be a fact. And of course, anyone a little bit more versed in the history of philosophy might hear some resonances with Kant's work. And Kant had a very big influence on Baudrillard, no doubt. But someone else might hear resonances of Nietzsche's work, because Nietzsche very much said the world doesn't have this thing called truth. We aren't going to find a truth in this world. All truths are going to be essentially perspectival. They're going to be reduced to individuals. Each person is going to come up with their own truth. We exist in a world of, and I forget the term he uses, by putting, I think it's, his quote is, by putting to death the artificial world, we've put to death the real world, or something like that.
You mean Baudrillard or Nietzsche?
Nietzsche.
Oh, okay. And I think that Baudrillard, he says, we put simulation, or at least total, what he later calls integral simulation, integral reality, is the putting death of the radical illusion of the world, right?
Yep. Exactly. So the simulacrum is something that I will hazard for now to say is different. And the simulacrum instead is going to correspond to a phase in which a distinction between reality and simulation, if I can say there is one, becomes blurred. Now, this is a very easy way of understanding it. So we might think here of digital technologies like televisions or computers, the internet, certain advancements in, I don't know, deep fakes or something, where it becomes difficult for us to know the difference between artifice and reality. Now, that poses some issues, because Baudrillard's concern is not just with the advent of new technologies. He's not just interested in new technologies emerging and the problems that they pose for humanity. Instead, his focus with the simulacrum is concerned instead with its gravitation towards its own perfection, or perfecting the world. Now, his concern is not necessarily with people spending time on the computer or watching TV. That is a part of it. But his concern is, I think, more firmly against the formation of, let's say, an algorithm that can perfectly predict what might happen. So one of the ways that he illustrates this is by drawing upon film, and he draws upon just Hollywood blockbusters a lot. He uses the film Minority Report, which is a movie that, I actually haven't seen the movie, but the plot centers on an organization that is able to predict when people are going to commit a murder before they've actually done it. So they're able to essentially punish them in advance. Now, this is the world that Baudrillard very much feared, a world of total control where there is
no reversibility.
No reversibility.
You mentioned that simulation has kind of always existed. And one of the things that I think is a misconception about Baudrillard is that he's only looking at simulation and simulacrum as a product of technology. But the simulacrum, let's use that word, has existed for a very long time. Arguably, cave paintings are the first simulacrum in a certain sense, because they're a sign that reflects something. It's just that the simulacrum evolves over time. And he illustrates that in multiple texts like Symbolic Exchange. He illustrates the different periods of the simulacrum, the 3 stages, and then he looks at the 4 stages of the image in Simulacra and Simulation. And you say reality and simulation are kind of interchangeable for Baudrillard. And I remember he says in a quote that reality as we know it isn't opposed to simulation. It's merely a case of that simulation. What he's afraid of, like you're saying at the end, is a simulation that is so perfect and kind of gets rid of all reversibility. And here's where I like to use the word illusion, because he says in The Perfect Crime that it's not, simulation isn't opposed to reality, but it's opposed to illusion. And that the perfection of simulation is sort of getting rid of illusion. Illusion, I think we can look at in many different ways, but kind of like the reversibility, the possibility of kind of outside of that, maybe for simplicity's sake, simulated reality. And we can also look at illusion kind of like imagination, something that we use in our everyday lives to sort of fill the gaps of things. When we read a text, for instance, we are imagining things as well as there's simulation involved, right? There's the signs that represent certain things, but we're also at the same time imagining things. I think we could say that real life, in a colloquial sense, real life, as we experience it, is sort of defined both historically by simulation and illusion. What Baudrillard's afraid of is not that there is no more reality. It's merely that this simulation is realizing so much. It's an excess of reality, as he puts it, that's getting rid of that illusion, that imagination. And this might be hard to kind of convey, but I would, for me, I think there's a lot of good examples, but one could say maybe pornography is that it's like a technical perfection of simulation. It kind of removes all illusion. And it's kind of one of the known side effects of pornography is that people will often imagine it when they're having sex. So it's like a perfect simulation that's I think Baudrillard would say obscene. It kind of reveals everything. There's no room for imagination whatsoever, that it kind of gets rid of that illusion. So that's more like a strong version of simulation. I guess you could say, talks about more negatively, as opposed to a binary distinction between simulation and reality, and that we need to go experience the real world or whatever. Because, as you're saying, and as he says, is most of reality is sort of in mix between simulation and illusion. And what he's afraid of is that non-contradictory, and as you cleverly use interchangeably, the non-contradictory reality and non-contradictory simulation. Do you think I'm getting this correctly, or do you have a better way of sort of expounding on that?
No, I think that's good. Like, he's also very mysterious because he makes it very clear that within all of these new technologies, within all of these new developments that we come to associate with simulation or the simulacrum, he says that there is still the possibility of illusion to seep in. So in the case of pornography, the way that he imagines that, or the problem that he has with it, is the way in which it just sanitizes what sex is. So with pornography, like just corresponding to the male gaze, essentially, like people aren't allowed to have hair in certain places. People are supposed to like bleach their certain orifices in order to fit a perfect standard, essentially turning the actors into dolls, into these perfect sanitized beings. And that is a way by which our idea about sex becomes synonymous with how pornography portrays it. And that is what concerns him, because it's just giving us a sanitized kind of absolutely true, I use true here kind of ironically, true version of sex that is just given over to the image of it or the ideal of it. But he says also that at the end of that, someone might say or whisper into someone's ear, "What are you doing after the orgy? What are you doing after this?" And he uses that possibility or that moment to highlight that there's still that little ember of the symbolic, if I can put it that way, little element of reversibility, a little element of illusion that remains in all of this. So there are examples of, I guess, reality sticking around. But again, even in the most what we might say.
Illusion or reality? We got to be careful with our words.
That's it. Even in the most real situations, imagine if you're dropped in the middle of the woods somewhere, the way in which you are going to respond to that situation is you're probably going to mediate it through your knowledge of the woods from like film and television that you may have seen in your life, or even the idea of there being nature, of there being a so-called real world is conditioned by our being only so much in proximity, or so often in proximity with artifice, with digital technologies and urban landscapes and so on. So reality is for him, as you said, not the opposite of simulation. Rather, they are two sides of the same coin, as I kind of put it earlier. Whenever we engage with the world, we are engaging with representations of the world, and we mediate our world through language, through images, through writing, and we've done this for millennia. And it just seems to be part of the human condition to some extent, if I can dare say there is a human condition. The type of reality that he fears then is not the reality that permits, these types of allows illusion to exist, allows maybe ambiguity to exist, that allows development and change to exist. His concern is with a reality that becomes more real than real. It just stands in for everything else. Hyperreality. And these terms go hand in hand. So he gives us another way to understand it, as you said, in The Perfect Crime, which was released in 91 or at some point in the early 90s. So about a little over 20 years after his first book, which is a problem because people have been reading it. And
The Perfect Crime is a lot better. It's a lot better. It's just because in the first page, he kind of makes that exact distinction we're making right now. Whereas in Simulacra and Simulation, he's super ambiguous. It's easy to think when reading Simulacra and Simulation that he's merely talking about digital technologies, or like it's associating simulacrum with that. Whereas in Perfect Crime, I think it's much more to the point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where he says that reality and simulation aren't opposed to one another. They're two sides of the same coin. His concern is with what he calls non-contradictory simulation versus what he likes, which is conflictual simulation. Now, because reality and simulation are two sides of the same coin, the same can be applied to reality. So there is conflictual reality and non-contradictory reality. Conflictual reality and conflictual simulation are the situations in which, change is allowed and people can engage in this thing called reversibility. And there aren't these universal equivalents that make perfect sense of anything. There isn't a kind of hegemonic scientific order that says that people have to act this way, or there are these personality tests online that says you are this personality type, and then you read it and you say, oh, I must act like this. This is who I'm supposed to be. That is non-contradictory reality or non-contradictory simulation, which is what concerns him. Not the conflictual kind where none of that exists and people just exist in what he calls their singularities. They exist just in themselves. They exist in their communities, and those communities are perfect. You don't have hegemonic, global powers saying how certain people should live, what certain people should do with their bodies, or how to control them, or anything. Or you don't have the logics of capital just subsuming everything under its logic, or just spreading its tentacles all throughout the globe to make everyone submit to it, essentially. So there's that distinction there that I think he was very much misguided to wait 20 some years to explain it in the early 90s.
Yeah, I think one term that's might clarify this for people a bit is reality. And a lot of the way people often think about reality is in a very scientific sense. The reality is just what exists, but that's not so much how Baudrillard is using it. I think we can maybe differentiate, just to make things easier, reality from the capital R real, right? We can say the real, maybe like the thing in itself, maybe in a Kantian sense, right? The thing that just absolutely exists. But the way Baudrillard is talking about reality is more in a practical cultural sense, in that what we perceive in our part of in our reality, in our perception of our subjectivity, it's for something to be in our reality, it has to be codified, it has to be quantified and represented by signs, images, language, etc. For example, like if we go out into the wilderness, there's only so much we will know about certain plants. We might have names for these plants, names for these colors, but for the things that we don't have any signs to reflect, they're not real in our sense of reality because they haven't been codified in that. They're sort of that unknown. But everything that is sort of put into signs is part of that reality. So that's kind of why I think he uses simulation and reality interchangeably. And the non-conflictual reality / non-conflictual simulation is when that illusion, that little unknown, that possibility for reversibility put to death by injecting reality onto it, by realizing everything. But this is where Baudrillard's kind of contradictory, and I find it's really interesting, is that while there's this propensity to always realize everything, put everything, to codify everything, to put everything into existence, to realize all possibilities, desires, there's still that unknown, that reversibility that always will exist. And I think in The Perfect Crime, he says the radical illusion of the earth can never be extinguished. It can never be fully put to death. It's impossible to get rid of, basically. It'll always, some level of it will exist. It, in fact, so-called reality needs a bit of this to maintain itself, because I think he says also in Perfect Crime in a kind of dramatic way that if there was no illusion and if everything was realized, the world as we know it would end. And I think it's sort of provocative, and not saying in a literal sense. I think he means metaphysically. If that makes sense at all. But I think for just practicality's sake, I think a way to explain how he differentiates reality, simulation, and illusion is the way we use these terms already in a practical basis. Have you ever wondered how, when you question anything outside of the political system, anything that is possible that isn't neoliberalism or whatever the status quo is, you'll often have the centrist, square-headed response that's like, you're not realistic. You're not being realistic. You need to think in reality. Oh, you need to be more grounded in reality. And that reality isn't necessarily... What is this saying? That reality is just the limitation of all possibilities beyond what it codifies, what it puts in that reality. So, for example, like we look at even though our political systems are run by all kind of voodoo, right? We believe in certain economic theories that don't hold up at all, like trickle down economics, whatnot. We believe in things like the deficit, which as people who will see my next video will notice is completely nonsense. But it's our reality nonetheless, right? And we need that illusion to kind of help reverse that to a certain extent. But to distinguish that reality and illusion is we look at no matter how ludicrous it might be, or what exists in our system or whatnot is reality. How we experience life on an everyday basis. I don't know, going to the same office job 9 to 5, that's reality. But how come in a lot of films, movies, or the way we refer to things like something like nature, people will refer it in a super mystical sense? They'll look at a forest, an interesting forest, and they'll say, oh, it's so mystical. It's so strange. Even though nature, or quote unquote, or a forest is just as, in a scientific sense, as real, a capital R, as anything can get, right? It exists prior to humans. But we look at that as kind of strange because anything that is kind of unknown and not codified by reality is outside of it. At least that's some way I like to think of illusion and reality, is because illusion requires imagination, and there's always an unknown. There's a lot of it is unknown. It's not objective, whereas reality is something we can objectify, we can see, we can define. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that he draws upon, or to illustrate this in Seduction, the book Seduction, is astrology. And he says that he doesn't bemoan or look down upon people who do astrology. he says that there's a lot of meaning to be taken from the stars. Now, this is not, I mean this to bar, the types of astrology that are peddled by, I don't know, Gwyneth Paltrow or some basic astrology stuff that just regurgitates the same scripts over and over again. But Baudrillard says that is just one example of us as humans opposing certain logics of quantification, of empiricism, efforts to make the world totally understandable and graspable. Now, you also said, and I think that you're right about this centrist imperative to gravitate everybody, or to make everyone gravitate towards that center position, because, as you said, they associate it with reality. But this reality is very much founded upon falsity. Like the very logics of capital just don't hold up very well to any kind of scrutiny. How is it that more and more value can be extracted from labor while that labor is constantly being devalued? It is not sustainable. There's no real logical basis for it, yet it persists. And this demonstrates that there isn't necessarily a legitimate basis for the formation of any given simulacrum in terms of like institutions. So in this case, capital. There doesn't need to necessarily be a legitimating basis for that. All there needs to be is power. There needs to be a certain will behind it to try to extend its logic as far as it can go. Now, this shows that there doesn't, for Baudrillard, I think, it doesn't need to have any kind of logical basis. It can just attain its status by existing, and existing forcefully, just as the logic of capital does. So that shows that even in the most perfect of worlds, it might be an absolutely perfect world founded on imperfection, founded on imperfect logic, if we're looking at it from the outside looking in. And that really, and I think Baudrillard is very much aware of that, how we are living a very absurd existence, and how we are living in a world that just doesn't make sense. And that makes it all the more ironic that we are trying to make sense of this world. And the world is always going to be, it will always escape us, trying to give it meaning. But you also said, or you presented just kind of briefly, the threat of the existential risk that he sort of humorously points to by saying that when the world has been perfectly understood, when the world has attained this, what he calls in the late work, integral reality, when the simulacrum reaches its apex, then the world will come to an end. And what he means by that is that the symbolic world will, in a sense, come to an end. People may not die. The world will keep revolving around the sun. But everything that we would traditionally associate with reality or the world, that is a world of ambiguity and illusion and mystery. As soon as all that comes to an end, then we'll just be non-autonomous robots living a completely determined existence, which will be essentially a living death. And it is in that way we will live a kind of, we won't be the world anymore. The world will have come to an end.
I think there's a great quote in The Intelligence of Evil, which illustrates exactly that. Literally on the first page, on the first line of the chapter, Integral Reality, where he says, what I call integral reality is an unlimited operational project whereby everything becomes real. Everything becomes visible and transparent. Everything is liberated. Everything comes to fruition and has a meaning. Whereas it's in the nature of meaning that not everything has it. And I think that's really interesting because, and he also says this in another lecture, which one can find on YouTube, called The Murder of the Real, where, for example, if for something to have meaning, something has to not have meaning, or else how else do you distinguish it? And for something to be real, something has to not be real. But if everything is quantified, everything is realized, and there's no less and less room for illusion, the real itself doesn't exist anymore. It's meaningless. It kind of disappears. Now, he has another line on here, which I think is interesting and to unpack, where he says, the disappearance of God has left us facing reality and the ideal prospect of transforming the real world. And we have found ourselves confronted with the undertaking of realizing the world, making it become technically, integrally real. Now the world, even freed from all illusion, does not lend itself to reality. Now these can be looked at as very contradictory statements. And I'd like to see how you unpack that. But I'll tell you what my interpretation is first, is, as we were saying earlier, simulation has kind of always existed. And real life as we know it has sort of been a mix of trying to quantify reality via representation and simulacrum, as well as illusion, which we use to kind of fill the gaps and imagine the possibilities, right? So, when we have the astrology or have maybe certain religious traditions, it's a form of illusion which we kind of use to give us meaning, but it's not something that's yet quantified. Whereas you could call, I think, state religion a simulacra in the sense that it's quantified. God is given an image. He's given, Jesus is given an image. We're given the Bible. We're given these texts to kind of put this into existence, but there's still the aspect of illusion. Now, with the death of God, we get science. So that's what I think he means by with the death of God left us just with reality, in the sense that we're left with trying to simulate the real world, so to speak. And that we can look at this starting with the classical age and the birth of the Enlightenment, the Copernican revolution, trying to really understand the quote unquote real world. Taken to its conclusion, we have to try to quantify everything. We have to understand everything. But Baudrillard says this is impossible. And what comes with the realization of everything, especially with now modern technology, the ability to film everything, to get everything on display, to, for lack of a better term, codify everything, that itself murders the real. Now, this is probably very contradictory, right? Because he's saying there's too much reality, there's an excess of reality, but that reality is disappearing. How do you explain that?
Yeah, by appealing to the two different kinds of reality. So there is conflictual reality, that's the good kind, that's disappearing, in favor of non-contradictory or non-conflictual reality being left in its stead, the type of reality that seeks to absolutely explain everything in the material world and to make us believe that whatever solutions it has come up with, whatever hegemonic order tells us we need to believe, be it trickle-down economics or be it belief that there is some kind of biological truth to gender, whatever absolute truth you want to stick in here, then when we have completely swallowed that, we have moved away from conflictual reality into non-contradictory, which is why I think it's very important to have a grasp of this difference between these two kinds of reality when reading his work, because otherwise you'd be like, well, he's just contradicting himself. This makes no sense.
Could we use hyperreality as non-conflictual reality?
I think
that's
so.
The more popular term. That's what often secondary sources like to usually use. They don't use the term non-conflictual reality often, probably just because he doesn't introduce that till much later in his work. But could we just call non-conflictual reality hyperreality?
I think so. I think so. And I think that one of the reasons that is the case is just because it is the more popular term. It does make sense. It does clear up some of those issues. But at the same time, it risks, because he doesn't always use that term in his work. So if you just approach it knowing the word hyperreality, if you go and read his stuff, he's not always going to be using that word to describe the bad kind of reality. So it's just important to have a grasp of that as well.
But I do think hyperreality can be used sort of as a synonym for this, because what is hyperreality is he defines in Simulacra and Simulation as being more real than the real. And because mainly it's more real than the quote unquote real life could ever be, because real life has simulation to an extent because you use language, we have pictures, we've always used these things, but there's always that illusion which we use to kind of fill the gaps. When things are more real than the real, it kind of realizes all that which was once left to illusion. And I think an example I like to think of for hyperreality, there's so many, but how good pictures are nowadays. If you've seen like the super high quality cameras, they're able to take these pictures, which you'll look at them, you almost think like the pictures are edited, but oftentimes they don't have to be. If you just take a picture with a really high quality camera, it captures way more of that, whatever you're taking a picture of, than the human eye could ever encapsulate. Like we'll see things in real life, but then we'll take it with like a super high quality camera. It looks way better. It's like more real than the real. And that's, I think, because what was left to illusion when we're looking at things in real life, we're not fully seeing everything. The way I make sense of this is just in a Kantian sense, in that there's sort of the noumenal world we can never fully comprehend, that is outside human perception. And I see that hyperreality, it kind of captures more what is left to imagination. That makes sense. So how does that tie into integral reality?
Yeah, that makes sense. But also remember, Baudrillard was a prolific photographer, and he wrote, he wrote very little about photography, but there's this one essay in, I believe it's in Impossible Exchange, but it could be in The Illusion of the End, but it's called Photography or the End of Light Writing, or Light Writing, something like that, in which he says that photography is actually a way to capture the just that illusion. It is a way to demonstrate that the world is, that's all it is it's just illusion, where you can capture it and someone won't know if they're looking at the real thing or if they're looking at an image. As you said, like photography can be, and it has been for a long time, it can be difficult to distinguish between the so-called real, that is the world that when we look outdoors and we're looking at, there's that world, but then there's that world represented in on the internet or in photography or whatever. And that shows just to that what extent that world is a fabrication. It is just part of our own, essentially our imaginations, our senses give it meaning, our eyes understand the world for us. And that is the case whether or not we're looking at that world through a perfect image or through the world itself. And this dovetails with a pretty obscure text of his called, it is actually building off the work of Sophie Calle. I think that's how you pronounce it. It was a French, I think she was a photographer. She's a French writer. But in this short text called Please Follow Me, Baudrillard reflects on the experiences of Sophie Calle, where Sophie Calle followed a man all around Europe and like taking pictures of him. It was very creepy. Like it's as creepy as you're imagining it now, like that, it is that creepy. So she followed this man around, and it's called Please Follow Me. And Baudrillard found this super interesting. And he used that story essentially to demonstrate what that signifies to follow somebody. And when you're following somebody, what you are essentially doing is you are demonstrating that no one's path is their own. It could easily be copied. It could easily be simulated to some extent. And this kind of idea we have about autonomy, about your own individual relationship with the world can so easily be overturned just by this demonstration that he reflects upon of following somebody else. So by capturing the world, by following someone else, what we are doing is showing that no person, the world isn't like a thing that stands outside of the world of representation, because it can be so easily captured and duplicated. It can be repeated. And so that for him takes it outside of having any kind of transcendence, existing above anything else. We are all just at the whims of this thing called reality. And the problem for him, as we've been going back and forth on, is with the kind of reality that puts that possibility to death, to say that no, this is the world, we've completely figured it out, We've put our stamp on it. We can wipe our hands and go away. If you don't like it, we'll incarcerate you. We'll put you to death. Whatever we'll do, and yeah, that'll be it.
Right. You mentioned at the start that about photography being able to capture illusion, but if one captures that illusion via photography, does it not then bring it into reality? Because it's now effectively simulated.
Well, that's part of the mystery, isn't it? As far as Baudrillard's work is concerned. And this is what I meant at the very beginning when I said that you can be very well versed in his thought and use terms like simulation and reality, simulation in the simulacrum, reality in the simulacrum. You can use those terms interchangeably with somebody else who really knows this stuff, and they'll know why you're using these terms interchangeably. Or you could be someone that doesn't know a whole lot, use the terms interchangeably with someone who knows the terms a whole lot, and that person might say, well, yeah, I think that you are just confused, which is part of the mystery. And I think that he tried to foster this mystery in his own work in order to be the demonstration of exactly what he wanted the world to be like: a world that is contradictory, a world that is ambiguous, a world that is unknowable. It's very difficult to situate Baudrillard and to make sense of his work, and he does this quite strategically, I think. I think in part
Derrida made me think of, but that's another story. But kind of, he conducts his project a bit like Derrida, like he lives his philosophy, if that makes sense.
I think so. I think so, and I believe it was Mike Gain, who's one of translators of Baudrillard's works. Mike Gain also Mike Gain compiled the first big collection of Baudrillard's interviews. I think it was called the Baudrillard Live, I think. Anyways, yeah, I collected a bunch of his interviews. But Mike Gain said that Baudrillard very much lived the type of life that like Deleuze and Guattari wrote about, very rhizomatic, opposing certain logics of capture that would seek only to codify, to quantify things, to typify them. He really evaded all of that. He didn't fit in very well in the whole French philosophy scene. He didn't really fit very well in the US. It was only people a little bit later in his career kind of took him up. He spent a lot of time traveling. He loved to do photography. And for those reasons, he was very much, I think, living out this life that he thought was that made sense to him, a life that just avoided this easy, avoiding being put into these boxes.
Yeah, he really is the high priest of postmodernism, isn't he? I think it's fair to give him that label. Regarding Simulacra and Simulation, just for the audience, though, I think an easy way to kind of understand that is that, yeah, like Simulacrum is sort of that representation of something, a copy of something, and it evolves obviously in stages, right? There can be simulacrum that has a referent, which is more like older type of simulacrum. Cave paintings is a representation of something, a sculpture perhaps, or even a direct photograph. And then there's simulacrum which have zero reference, that only reference other simulacrum, and something he kind of associates quite heavily with sort of the realm of hyperreality. Regarding simulation, I think it's just like the process by which simulacrum or simulacra plural occur. I think it's an easy way to sort of understand that. It's sort of the process of it. So I think that's why a lot of people use it interchangeably.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair. It is, the short answer is to say that it's a copy of a copy. It is when Xerox is introduced, and now any attachment to the origin is completely lost. The only issue there is you can be led astray when reading Baudrillard's work to think that, oh, well, underneath all of the simulacrum or simulacra, there's truth. And all we need to do is we need to put aside the television and the internet and the phone,
yeah, exactly,
and photography, and then we're going to be left with truth. That doesn't exist. There is nothing there. All you will find is just, even if you throw yourself in the densest forest in the middle of nowhere with no attachment at all to anything electronic, anything digital, anything simulated, let's say, you're staring at a tree, you are engaging with a representation, a simulation of that tree, just because not only is your history going to influence the way that you understand that tree, a history that was simulated, a history that you living in a world that fed you ideas. So ideology, discourse, all of these things are going to influence your interpretation of that tree. But even in the most rudimentary way, looking at the tree is just your eyes getting sense data from the light reflecting off of it, which then your brain makes sense of. You don't actually see the tree, right? Hence the Kant stuff. So yes to what you said, but also it's important to acknowledge that there is no truth underneath all the copies of copies.
But this brings me to my next point. But to further illustrate what you're just saying, is I think a good way to think of it is if one just observes nature in the forest. Let's look at, I don't know, a certain tree. Is that tree a tree if you take away that language, right? Is the tree is merely the sign we give to that? And we have all our signs that we use to kind of give that tree a purpose and what that is, as opposed to just purely look at it. It just is what it is. The sign is what we call it a tree. Or if, let's say, we look at the colors of things. Green is a color, and we can only differentiate what green is by seeing what blue is and what red is, what isn't green. They're all signs. But if we're to get rid of all these things, there isn't like a quote unquote like truth. It just is there, if that makes sense. It's just, like you said, our eyes looking at something and giving us sense data through the reflection of the light. And the thing though about there not being a truth underneath the simulacrum can be confusing for some. And Baudrillard has the quote where he says, it's dangerous to unmask images because we'll reveal that there's nothing behind them. And in the first page of Simulacra and Simulation, he has a quote which isn't his. It's from Ecclesiastes. And it's a quote that's often used in a lot of memes and sometimes falsely attributed to Baudrillard, ironically. But the simulacrum is not.
But it's false. It's not a true Ecclesiastes quote either.
Yeah, he said he said that in an interview that he just made it up.
Yeah,
I find that interesting, but it still illustrates his point. That's what I'm about to say. Is the simulacrum is not what hides the truth; it's the truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true. And that's, even though it's kind of just like he's made it up. It does illustrate his point, in the sense that the simulacrum is not hiding a truth. It kind of creates that truth. It creates that reality as we know it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. And this is the image of the map that he gives us at the beginning of Simulacra and Simulation from Borgia's fable, where the map completely covers the territory to the point that the map is indistinguishable from the territory.
This still might sound like make some heads explode. It made my head explode for months. Just because it kind of flips everybody's conception of reality on its head. But there's some other quotes where I think he illustrates this kind of well, in that he says on multiple occasions in The Intelligence of Evil that reality has barely had time to exist. The reality is a new thing. And he says, the reality that has invented itself over recent centuries and which we have elevated into a principle is now dying out, to which to revive it at all cost as a reference or a moral value is a mistake, since the principle is dead. Now, this brings me to my next question, is the difference between the reality and reality principle, because he kind of indicates that reality as we know it, at least as we colloquially discuss it, is sort of a recent phenomena. And when he says recent centuries, what I assume he is referring to is the Enlightenment. And that we kind of, this idea of reality, sort of the idea that of finding a quote unquote real world, giving meaning, injecting reality into the unknown and giving meaning to these things, realizing all of these things which were once left to illusion. That's what he means by, I think, reality invented over recent centuries. Or one could say maybe before with, I guess you could say, state religion, but then he says the death of God left us with reality. So I think he's referring a bit to the Enlightenment, and that this so-called reality as we know it being a new thing. Because if you think about it, let's take as problematic as this can be, but let's take like a caveman, or I don't know, a tribe that is pre-civilization. Do they walk around thinking about, oh, like this is reality, or oh, we're living in reality, this is reality, this is not reality? No, they just like live, if that makes sense. The distinction between reality and not reality is this idea that there can be a reality and codify things and put it into this existence. And that's why I think he uses simulation so interchangeably with reality. But he uses this term reality in differently from the reality principle. And in that quote I just read, where he says, reality has barely had time to exist, but it's disappearing because its principle is dead. What is the difference between the reality principle and reality as such for Baudrillard?
Well, to hazard a guess, that would also inform, or that approach also informs his criticisms of Marx and Freud, both of whom sought to find so-called truth of human existence. So Freud attributed to the psyche that housed all of, was essentially was a gold mine to understand humanity. And then his criticism of Marx, notably this idea of arriving at scientific socialism that I think Baudrillard believed Marx uncritically adopted or believed in, because it's just harkens to this idea of empiricism, irrationalism, materialism that will try to put all the illusions of the world to death. Religion is the opium of the people, so on and so forth. So the reality principle corresponds to these logics, these efforts to understand the world as embodying a truth or having a truth, and then making that truth applicable to virtually everyone, like Freud. And, we have this idea of the id, ego, and superego essentially guiding everyone's impulses, or the eros, the life drive, versus thanatos, the death drive. And we can explain away all human interactions based off of that. Or with Marx, we can explain it away based off economic conditions, whatever. And Baudrillard was just dissatisfied with such approaches just because they limit everything. That is, they put into practice this idea that there is a truth to reality, and they just take it all the way with this guiding principle. I don't know if that makes it clearer at all.
Yes. No, I saw that too, in that sense that, Marx and Freud are both products of the Enlightenment as well, of course. And along with liberal thinkers being also different products of the Enlightenment. I think this could be confusing because one would read into this, maybe say, what is the use of Baudrillard? And to me, I see him kind of the way I see a lot of other postmodern thinkers like Derrida or Foucault, in that I see them more not so much as a prescriptive value, but rather that they can kind of act as that illusion, as that reversibility, to kind of question what we take for granted.
Yeah, I think so. And he sits very comfortably as well in that camp of critique, committing himself very much to critique, to throwing thought grenades, not necessarily providing us a roadmap of what necessarily to do, but pointing to the limits of any one given school of thought, be it Marxism, be it psychoanalysis, and so on.
Regarding what you were saying before, I think it's important to clarify again just about the reality principle, because that and how it differs from quote unquote reality, I think, is something interesting and worth interrogating a bit. Now, I want to read a couple of quotes from Baudrillard that discuss this, and I want to see how you interpret them. In Intelligence of Evil, he says, "Let us be clear about this. When we say reality has disappeared, the point is that it has not disappeared physically, but that it has disappeared metaphysically. Reality continues to exist. It is its principle that is dead." And in here he says, "We invested reality with the whole of our imaginary, but it is this imaginary that is vanishing, since we no longer have the energy to believe in it. Even the will has gone out of it. The passion for reality and the passion for truth have gone. All that remains is a duty of reality. Henceforth, we must believe in it, as doubt sets in everywhere as a product of the failure of systems of representation. Reality becomes an absurd imperative. It is the excess of reality that makes us stop believing in it.
If the real is disappearing, it's not because we lack of it. On the contrary, there is too much of the real.
Now, the way I see this is sort of that when everything becomes realized and there's less illusion left, what he's saying, the death of reality, is the death of, like you were saying before, the so-called good kind of reality, the non-conflictual reality. And we get this, the death of the conflictual reality, the reversible one. And what we get is this non-conflictual reality, but it is in the nature of meaning, in the nature of reality, that there's something that is not, right, to differentiate that. So when all there is everything becomes realized, without the illusion, reality as we know it that has existed can no longer really exist. This is still, it's hard to kind of encompass. How would you explain the differentiation between the reality principle and reality and those quotes I just laid out?
Yeah, in terms of the reality principle, it's a good question. I've never actually thought about it, but what I would say is that insofar as principles are going to describe efforts to, I guess, make things completely intelligible, it's going to oppose those attempts, those efforts to make things fully understandable or graspable. And so long as that reality is in play, that principle is in play, it's going to pose problems for us forming any kind of meaningful beliefs in the world that oppose those logics. And so while reality is going to exist still, this, as the reality as we've been laying it out, this conflictual reality, the very principle that is the problem that tries to make the world fully understandable, fully graspable, will come to an end. And that's the good thing for him. Yeah. And what was the second part?
The excess of reality makes us stop believing in it. And what we're left with is the death of the reality principle and only a duty of reality. Sort of like the duty of, for example, like when he also compares us to God, like when we have to believe in God, it already disappears.
Yeah.
In the sense that if we have to believe in reality, don't you believe in the truth? And the way I like to think about it is, don't you believe in science?
Yeah.
We hear that a lot. It already disappears. I think that's what he's saying, but I think it's still, I have to have trouble kind of grappling with that.
Well, the easy answer might be that reality as a conflictual thing starts to go away when there's an excess of reality, when reality becomes more real than real, when it becomes hyper real, then the very idea of reality as something that opens or welcomes change and development will start to go away. So we can understand it in that way. But another way that we can approach it is that as the world grows more perfect, as it becomes more understandable and graspable, so too does the capacity to see the absurdity behind it all. So like photography, like to go back to that, even if you have a perfect image, that perfect image is going to demonstrate just how even something perfect can be a replication. It is not real. So I actually brought up, I found that quote, or I found that essay. And he says right off the bat in that essay, or starts like this: the miracle of the photograph of that allegedly objective image is that through it, the world shows itself to be radically non-objective. That's just the first line there. And I think that it's in that way that an excess of reality actually undoes that very reality. And this also corresponds to another way to understand reversibility in his work, where if anything becomes, or if anyone attains power, or if anything becomes too perfect, it will welcome its own undoing. Its own reversal will just be implied within it. And any other effort to oppose it is just going to be consumed into its logic. Everything needs to run its course for Baudrillard to some extent And that just happens by the very impossibility of maintaining perfection or maintaining power. And I'm drawing upon a number of his texts here, so I could be leading us astray, but I think that might address your question.
The way I like to apply it kind of in the real world is, let's think of science. Okay. So with science, we have supposedly gotten so perfect at determining objective facts, so to speak, with greater technology, greater research methodology, greater discoveries, and all of that. And I think you could see at the high point something like genomics, where we can detect cancerous genes already from birth, stuff like that. Like, we're supposedly advancing so much in science, but at the same time, and this is not me trying to be like a anti-science, whatever, but the point being is that, okay, as stuff gets more perfect, we also start to see anything that kind of undermines that perfection, cracks it even more. The way I like to look at this as the more faith we're supposed to have in science of getting perfect, if there's anything that merely contradicts it a little bit, it puts a hole in the whole thing. And then you'll have doubt spread everywhere. I think we can see this most potently with something like the coronavirus, because as science is supposed to get so perfect at predicting, right? We've seen numerous predictions that COVID would be over within the first few months, then after a year, then we're still here, right? Their predictions continue to be wrong. And I think that's why you have a lot of anti-vaxxers. You have people who become very, very critical because they see one little contradiction and then they don't believe in the thing at all. So the response is often from the liberal media or whatever, centrist media, whatever one wants to call it, will respond kind of by saying, don't you believe in science? And it's like, there's almost this moral duty to believe in science. Like, don't you believe in God? You're questioning God, And once you have to do this, it's kind of already disappeared. It's because the principle is dead and you have to kind of uphold it through this moral obligation. This is not me kind of, necessarily condoning the anti-vaxxers, but what I would say is people have a right to be critical. Where I think people go wrong, the anti-vaxxers, is they sort of inject their own reality sometimes in the form of conspiracy theories. So they'll kind of inject their reality by saying, oh, it's part of a new world order conspiracy. It's part of this population control or whatever, trying to kill people, whatever, microchip your brain, who knows. But I think people, like the fact that people are critical of science is inevitable, because even people within science are becoming critical of science in the sense that there's, I have various friends who study in the fields of biology and chemistry. And one thing I keep hearing is that there's a replication crisis, that there's a problem with trying to replicate certain studies. And as we know, it requires replication to get any so-called objective findings, that we can't really infer a objective truth from a study or an objective finding without it being replicatable. So with a replication crisis, there's more and more doubts that seeds in. As a system gets more perfect at trying to find answers to everything, it crumbles on its own weight, because any little cracks it has, any little mishaps, it'll kind of set even more doubts on it. I don't know if that is a good way to make sense of it, but that's kind of how I see this playing out in the real world. I think another example actually is Trump. See, Trump we always knew that politicians always lied, right? We can say we know this. Trump came in there, kind of completely blurred the boundary completely. He just, unrelentlessly bullshitted. Now you have, with that, people are saying, oh, Trump brought in post-truth era, whatever. Trump destroyed our notion of truth. And you have Biden coming after, kind of trying to not so much revive truth, so to speak, because, it's not like he doesn't lie. It's not like he's not just another politician. He comes in there and tries to revive the reality truth principle by saying, oh, we believe in science. We believe in facts. And it's like this moral obligation that he's trying to resurrect. But it doesn't really work because the doubt is still there. And the fact that he has to even use it as a moral principle means that the foundation of the reality principle has died. I don't know if I'm grasping this or completely off. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think that that's totally fair. This whole Trump thing is utilized certainly by people on the left, despite the fact that they are very much legitimate in their criticisms. but they use it as a way to say like, oh, we are legitimate because we are not them who are illegitimate, when in fact, still, as you said earlier, these logics of capitalism, for instance, remain unquestioned. So we see, and this is just one way that we kind of absolve ourselves of having to actually consider these things, because we say, oh, the crazy people are over here. It's obviously a charged term, but people who are politically different than us are over there, and they're the ones we associate with falsity, with untruth, and so on. So therefore, we are the good ones. And in Baudrillard's works, it's just about talking about like Disneyland, or uses Disneyland to think about that, where when we're at Disneyland, or we use the image of Disneyland to say that the rest of America is real because that's what's fake. Disneyland is fake. It's cartoonish. Everything else is legit, when that's like absolutely not the case. But yeah, no, all this to say, I agree.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Disneyland in the same text, Simulacra and Simulation. He also mentions Watergate with Richard Nixon, and that sort of that scandal about Watergate and all the outrage it spawned in the media sort of reinforced the myth, or reality principle that everything is otherwise normal in the political system. Politicians aren't corrupt, and that somehow Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal was outside of the norm, and it kind of reinforced the system's sort of reality, I'll call it. Trump, to a certain extent, does the same thing, although I think what differentiates the Trump era from the Nixon era is, I think, the reality principle is dead in the Trump era, because I think in the Nixon era there is still such outrage about like the Watergate scandals, or when politicians are lying, and then we can just go back to normal. And there's this attempt with the Democrats to kind of act like Trump is something out of the ordinary. But I think Trump was such a product of what was already happening gradually, right? We had Reagan, like a hyperreal president who was literally an actor. And we had George Bush, who, they openly lied about weapons of mass destruction. I think people have been doubting the system for quite a long time. And with Trump, he isn't masking the absence of some sort of truth. Trump was usually open about it, in the sense that he would be like, oh, we want to go to, we went to Iraq because we wanted to take their oil. It's like, why do we do trade with Saudi Arabia? Oil. He's this transparent, right? And then you have the attempt with the Biden administration, or you see Trump's whatever her name is, press secretary or something, who said we have alternative facts, right? Which is like kind of always
Kellyanne Conway.
Yeah. And whereas you see with the Biden administration, it's sort of this attempt to revive truth, so to speak, to revive it as a principle. But I think the doubt is set so deep that the Trump no longer can reinforce the system's reality principle like the Nixon Watergate scandal did. I think at this point, the reality principle is just, we only have like a duty to sort of believe in like the functioning of the system. We have a duty to believe in truth. We have a duty to believe in science, whatnot. I think that's at least where that text and that point of Baudrillard really resonated, is especially because I was reading it during COVID. It made sense, or at least that's how I make sense of it. I'm still not sure if I'm off base.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's very legitimate. I don't think I'd have much more to add to that point, because I agree.
Okay, on that regard, we're kind of running out of time, but there's just so much to cover with Baudrillard, and we could probably do another podcast on this at some point. But I would say maybe one more question, just because I assume the people who have already gotten this far probably are keeners and are into theory. So for the listeners, what would be the best way you would suggest to approach Baudrillard's text and how to understand what he says? Like, which text would you recommend first? What are the best ways to read them? And which of your podcasts maybe could help understand some of those texts? Because I've listened to just about all of them. But which ones would you recommend to the listeners?
Of my stuff, probably the ones I did on The Perfect Crime, I think I was the most happy with. I also did a lot of those Baudrillard episodes long ago when my production quality wasn't quite as good. But as far as books go, The Perfect Crime is a very good one to, I would dare say, even start with. But
at least the first 3 chapters.
Sure.
It gets confusing after, in my opinion, very confusing after.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Then just stick to the first couple of chapters. Then probably the classics, Simulacra and Simulation. You could try read them in order, but I think that might lead you astray. My favorites are really probably Seduction, Symbolic Exchange, and Death, for a critique of the political economy of the sign. And The Mirror of Production is quite good. I mean, I like them all. Start with those ones. I think that'll give you a very good basis upon which to approach some of the more difficult ones. And by more difficult ones, I mean like Fatal Strategies. I think the ones you mentioned. I think the ones you mentioned are difficult. Like, honestly, you're doomed no matter what you do.
Yeah, I think Perfect Crime is the most intelligible, at least like the first few chapters anyway, until he gets into the irony of technology, and then after that it gets kind of confusing. But I think he has good chapters in the Perfect Crime that really illustrate it, like the illusion of the world or the height of reality, stuff like that. And I think The Intelligence of Evil, the one we kept referencing, The Intelligence of Evil is like really short. I find that one, there's not a single wasted sentence, in my opinion, especially in the chapter Integral Reality. I thought that's one where it explains sort of what you kept saying, the non-conflictual reality. I think that text is excellent. Although, yeah, of course, Seduction is pretty important, and Symbolic Exchange. But I find those are pretty difficult to read, especially if one doesn't have a lot of background in French critical theory.
Yeah, I think I think that you're very right. So yeah, start with even The Intelligence of Evil, which is technically his last book, but it is more accessible. And I think that the same would follow with some of the other later essays, like Screened Out, or that compilation of essays. They really explain, or that's where he really explains his disdain for arriving at perfection or trying to completely understand the world, to put mystery, illusion to death. That's where he really lays it out. And then that might allow you to better understand his earlier stuff, understand what exactly it is about Simulacrum that he disdains, that troubles him so much. What is it about seduction that poses a challenge to those logics, or reversibility poses a challenge to those logics of the Simulacrum? Then I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Anyways, David, great having you on. This, I would, if it was up to me, I would keep this much longer, but for the sake of the audience and heads not exploding. But for now, I would highly suggest my audience to go check out your podcast, especially your Baudrillard stuff and all of that. You also have I believe you've written articles on Baudrillard. If you'd like me to share them, I can do that as well.
Yeah.
Go check out David's stuff. And if you enjoy my podcast and the videos I do, and you want to get access to exclusive podcasts as well, you can chip in $1 or $2 on Patreon. That's very much appreciated. And hope you enjoyed.
It's the excess, the overdose of reality that puts an end to reality. The excess of information that puts an end to information. The excess of communication that puts an end to communication.
Baudrillard's definition of the real itself is that which can be simulated, Xeroxed, and copied. So whether you're talking about a human body where you can make a holograph of it, or you're talking about the Bible, which you can Xerox, or whether you're talking about the sexual act, which can be simulated either through repetitive pornographic films, or in a very near future, it will be able to be simulated with virtual reality, where you'll wear a full body suit and make love to your ego ideal, thus making it pointless to search out all the Freudian implications, you can just pick your ego ideal, punch it into the laser beam program, slip into the virtual reality suit, thus rendering that relation, even that intimate relation, sexual relation, technological, simulatable, reproducible to infinity.